While WWE wrestlers train for years to perfect their moves, sometimes these moves can go horribly wrong and lead to life-changing outcomes. In this video, we're looking at the times WWE moves didn't go as planned and ended careers, starting with the most lethal pedigree of all time. Long before Triple H became the King of Kings, the pedigree was already his finisher. On May 28, 1996, on a Superstars taping, Triple H squared off with enhancement talent Marty Garner, a wrestler barely 6 months into his WWF run. Garner had never taken a pedigree before and had no idea what the move actually was. He assumed it was some kind of double underhook powerbomb or suplex. So when Triple H locked him in, Garner jumped and tried to flip out of it instead of landing on his face. The result was one of the most brutal-looking botches ever in wrestling, as Garner came down almost directly on the crown of his head. He suffered neck damage, narrowly escaped being paralyzed, and the footage went viral in wrestling circles for years, with rumors swirling that Garner had sued the company. After this, Triple H became far more careful teaching newer talent how to safely take the pedigree. But while that incident was a case of inexperience, this next incident happened because a wrestler was pushed into doing something his body simply wasn't built for. Sid Vicious, also known as Sid Justice and Psycho Sid, was one of the most dominant-looking big men of the 90s. By January 2001, he was back in WCW, chasing the world title in the promotion's dying days. At the Sin pay-per-view, Sid competed in a 4-way match for Scott Steiner's title. According to Sid, WCW official John Laurinaitis had been pushing him for weeks to add an aerial move to his arsenal, despite Sid's size and his own discomfort with it. But reluctantly, he agreed. Going for a jumping big boot off the second rope, Sid landed with his full weight on one leg while kicking with the other. His tibia and fibula snapped completely, in a compound fracture visible even from the cheap seats. He needed a 17-inch steel rod surgically implanted and years of rehab just to walk again, let alone wrestle. Sid later sued, claiming he was coerced into the spot against his better judgment, though the courts ultimately ruled against him. But if Sid's injury was a case of a performer being pushed past his limits, this next one happened between two people who trusted each other completely. And it still went horribly wrong. Big E had spent years as one of WWE's most reliable and beloved performers in the New Day. On March 11, 2022, during a tag match on SmackDown teaming with Kofi Kingston against Ridge Holland and Sheamus, Big E and Holland brawled to the outside of the ring. Holland went for an overhead belly-to-belly suplex, a move the two had presumably run through before. But Big E didn't rotate enough in the air and came down directly on the top of his head. It was immediately clear something was seriously wrong. Big E was stretchered out and taken to a hospital, and it was later revealed he'd fractured both his C1 and C6 vertebrae. Thankfully, there was no spinal cord or ligament damage, sparing him from paralysis. But his in-ring career was over. Holland faced a brutal wave of online abuse and even death threats in the aftermath, despite Big E publicly and repeatedly insisting he held no ill will toward him. Holland has since said the incident became a black cloud over the rest of his WWE run. But while that injury happened in front of millions on TV, this next one happened in a bingo hall and involved one of the best in-ring performers of all time. By 2014, AJ Styles had already established himself as one of the most decorated stars outside the WWE. After leaving TNA, Styles set off on a world tour that took him through Japan, Ring of Honor, and the UK. On March 1, 2014, he appeared for Preston City Wrestling in England, main eventing against Scottish star Lionheart for the promotion's title. Lionheart was one of the biggest names on the UK independent scene at the time, and the match itself went smoothly right up until the finish. Styles set up for the Styles Clash, his inverted facebuster finisher that had already gone wrong a few times throughout his career. The move only works safely if the person taking it goes limp and lets their body flip through. Lionheart instead tucked his chin, landed directly on the crown of his head, and broke his neck instantly. Remarkably, Lionheart returned to wrestling about a year later, though he later said Styles never reached out to check on him afterward. The incident became one of several cautionary tales tied to the Styles Clash, alongside similar injuries suffered by Roderick Strong, Yoshitatsu, and Frankie Kazarian. But while Styles went on to become a multi-time world champion in WWE and a decorated star, despite this incident, our next incident gave birth to one of the most heated beefs in wrestling history. In November 1999 at Starrcade, Bret Hart stepped into the ring with Goldberg. Before the match, Bret gave Goldberg one simple instruction, and that was not to hurt him. Goldberg instead did the exact opposite. When it came time for the match's final stretch, Goldberg drilled Bret full force in the side of the head with a kick. Bret described it like getting hit with a hockey stick, and he genuinely couldn't remember the finish of the match afterward. He kept wrestling in the days that followed, unaware of how serious the damage actually was, until he flew home to Calgary and saw a concussion specialist who told him the back of his skull felt like hamburger. Bret was diagnosed with post-concussion syndrome, forced to relinquish the world title in January 2000, and retired from in-ring competition later that year. He said for decades that he doesn't believe it was an accident, and the two have never fully patched things up. However, this wasn't the only time a kick went wrong and forced a wrestler into retirement. In December 2017, just weeks after returning from injury, Paige teamed with Absolution stablemates Mandy Rose and Sonya Deville at a house show against Bayley, Mickie James, and Sasha Banks. During the match, Paige called for a spot she'd taken dozens of times before, a kick to the back from Banks. She'd even taken the same move from Bayley the night before with no issue, but her neck simply wasn't as strong as she believed, and when Banks's kick landed, it snapped her neck back with enough force that Paige described it like whiplash from a car accident. She lost feeling in her arms and then her legs, terrified she was paralyzed. Paige retired just months later at only 25 years old. She's been adamant ever since that none of it was Sasha's fault, but Banks faced brutal fan backlash regardless. In a miraculous turn of events, Paige was able to rehab through the injury and returned to the ring years later in AEW, where she held the Women's World title, and even returned to the WWE at WrestleMania 42, winning the tag titles with Brie Bella. But while Paige suffered the neck injury at a young age, this next wrestler collapsed in the ring in his late 50s. Sting's WWE run had been a long time coming. The WCW icon finally arrived in the company in late 2014 after decades of speculation. By September 2015, at 56 years old, he found himself in the main event of Night of Champions challenging Seth Rollins for the WWE World Heavyweight Championship. Midway through the match, Rollins hit Sting with the buckle bomb, and something immediately went wrong. Instead of hitting the buckle with his upper back, Sting's neck absorbed the impact, and he crumpled to the mat, visibly shaking out his hands trying to get feeling back into them. He fought through it and finished the match, even collapsing again before the bout ended, ultimately losing to a roll-up. Afterward, Sting was diagnosed with cervical spinal stenosis. He never wrestled for WWE again, announcing his retirement the following April during his Hall of Fame induction, though he'd eventually return to the ring years later in AEW. Sting has never blamed Rollins, calling it his own fault for hitting the buckle wrong, and has praised him as one of the best he ever worked with. But while Rollins' buckle bomb hurt a legend near the end of his career, this next injury happened to a legend at the absolute peak of his. And ironically, even this incident involved Sting. In May 1994, Rick Rude challenged Sting for the WCW International World Heavyweight Championship in Japan. During the match, Sting went for a dive to the outside, and when the two collided, Rude's back caught the edge of the raised platform surrounding the ring. Rude was in visible pain, but he kept going, absorbing more bumps for the rest of the match and even winning the title before it was over. The damage, though, was severe enough to end his in-ring career at just 35 years old, and he was stripped of the belt days later. Rude collected on a Lloyd's of London insurance policy and never wrestled a full-time match again, though he'd resurface in non-wrestling roles with ECW and WWE's D-Generation X. He was reportedly bitter for years that Sting hadn't better protected him on the dive. But while Rude's injury ended a career quietly, our next entry involves one of the most notorious in-ring accidents of all time. By the summer of 1997, Austin was on the rise, feuding with the Hart Foundation and Owen Hart for the Intercontinental Championship heading into SummerSlam. Austin himself had actually suggested the finish of the match to be a piledriver reversal, though he specifically asked for the safer tombstone-style variant The Undertaker used, where the attacker drops to both knees to cushion the landing. Owen felt more comfortable with the standard sit-down version instead and assured Austin he wouldn't get hurt. When the moment came, Austin's head was positioned too low, and when Owen sat down, Austin's skull drove straight into the mat. Austin was legitimately paralyzed, unable to feel his arms or legs, and had to tell the referee not to let Owen touch him. Owen stalled for time, taunting the crowd, until Austin regained just enough control to crawl over and weakly roll Owen up for the win. Austin ended up with a bruised spinal cord and years of chronic neck problems that eventually forced neck fusion surgery and, ultimately, his retirement in 2003. But while the piledriver became one of the most feared moves in wrestling almost overnight, this next finisher earned that same reputation 2 decades later, and for the exact same reason. In what was meant to be a routine dark match, Samoa Joe faced Tyson Kidd at a WWE Superstars taping in June 2015. Joe hit the Muscle Buster to finish the match as he had hundreds of times before. But this time, things went horribly wrong. Kid's C2 ligament ruptured, causing his disc to strike his own spinal cord and triggering temporary paralysis. Kid underwent emergency surgery that left him with a rod, screws, and staples fused into his neck, and while he made an extraordinary recovery, doctors ruled he could never take a bump again. He's remained with WWE ever since as a respected backstage producer. Joe has called the incident the single largest regret of his career and stopped using the Muscle Buster for months on WWE's main roster out of respect for Kid. Even as some analysts have pointed out, the move itself wasn't inherently dangerous, it was just unlucky timing. But while Joe's regret over that night has never faded, this next incident involving him did even more direct damage to his career. Years before his WWE run, Samoa Joe was TNA's Wrecking Machine, a dominant world champion feuding with the legendary Sting in the main event of Bound for Glory 2008. The match spilled into the crowd, climbing a long flight of concrete stairs inside the arena, building toward a spot that was originally planned as a flying forearm. But in the chaos of the crowd, Sting ended up positioned differently than planned, and Joe had to improvise mid-air, converting it into a running dropkick that sent him crashing back first down the concrete steps. It looked horrifying, and the moment instantly became wrestling legend, with fans and even fellow wrestlers insisting for over a decade that Joe had broken his tailbone and was permanently altered by the bump. His in-ring style slowed down, and Joe kept gaining weight for years afterward as a result. However, Joe isn't the only wrestler whose career drastically changed after a move gone wrong. Matt Hardy suffered a similar twist of fate. By September 2005, the feud between Matt Hardy and Edge had become one of the most personal storylines WWE had ever seen. Their steel cage match at Unforgiven was the emotional peak of that program, and it built toward an unforgettable visual. Hardy climbing to the very top of the cage and delivering a diving leg drop straight down onto Edge. The crowd erupted, and Hardy picked up the win, but the damage to his own body was immediate and lasting. He couldn't walk without a limp for a full 4 weeks afterward, and years later revealed the bump was a turning point in how he approached his in-ring style, since his hips and lower back never fully recovered. Hardy noticeably slowed down his wrestling style after this incident and even gained weight just like Joe. But while Hardy's injury reshaped his career, this next move didn't just alter a career, it led to the darkest day in WWE history. Chris Benoit built his reputation on a hard-hitting, high-impact style, and one of the signature pieces of that style was the diving headbutt. Over more than 2 decades and roughly 1,000 matches, Benoit took that bump again and again, alongside countless other head-first impacts and unprotected chair shots common to that era of wrestling. In June 2007, the Benoit tragedy shocked the wrestling world and prompted his father to request an examination of his brain. Researchers who studied the tissue found Benoit had an advanced case of CTE caused by repeated head trauma, with doctors comparing the state of his brain to that of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. This wasn't a case of a move going wrong once, but an accumulation of years of damage. And if you want to find out the entire story behind this dark tragedy and the full details of the aftermath, check out this video next.